Hello, I'm Terrence McNally, and welcome to today's podcast. If it doesn't spread, it's dead, is the simple, consistent message of a new book, Spreadable Media, Creating Value and Meaning in a Networked Culture, that maps the changes taking place in our media environment. For all their consolidation, concentration, and money, corporations can no longer control media distribution. Millions are now directly involved in the creation and circulation of content. Stickiness, focusing attention in centralized places, has been the measure of success in the broadcast era. No more. Spreadability, dispersing content through formal and informal networks with and without permission, is the new goal. What does this mean for media, for information, for culture, for the distribution of power? And how can you take advantage of the new realities to have greater impact and influence in the days ahead? I'll be talking about all this with one of the book's authors, Henry Jenkins. He coined the term participatory culture, and he's been paying attention for decades to the crowd on the other side of the camera, the other side of the microphone, the other side of the screen. Here on Freeforum, we explore the lives, the work, and the ideas of individuals that I suspect have pieces of the puzzle of a world that just might work. We look at new, innovative, and provocative approaches to business, environment, health, science, politics, and media, all based on the fact that I believe we can do better, and I want to find out how. Henry Jenkins is the Provost Professor of Communications, Journalism, and Cinematic Art at the University of Southern California. He directed MIT's Comparative Media Studies graduate degree program from 1993 to 2009, setting an innovative research agenda during a time of fundamental change in communication, journalism, and entertainment. One of the first media scholars to chart the changing role of the audience in an environment of pervasive digital content, Jenkins is recognized as a leading thinker in the effort to redefine the role of journalism in the digital age. His books include Convergence Culture, Where Old and New Media Collide, Fans, Bloggers, and Gamers, Exploring Participatory Culture, and his newest, with co-authors Sam Ford and Joshua Green, Spreadable Media, Creating Value and Meaning in a Networked Culture. Welcome again, Henry Jenkins, to Freeforum.
Happy to be here.
Okay. I like listeners to get a feel for the people behind the work and the ideas that we talk about. Now, normally, I would ask you to tell us in your own words a bit about your path to the work that you're doing today. Feeling free to mention mentors, turning points, moments of decision, but I want you to do more than that. I want you to expand that question. At what point did you start paying attention, as I mentioned in the intro, to viewers, listeners, fans? Was it before you and the rest of us realized that media and communication were becoming more interactive? And could you trace those two threads, your interest in media audiences and the evolution of both media and audiences, to the situation we see now, where both have changed, where culture is participatory, and media wants to be spreadable?
Sure. I was growing up in Atlanta during the Civil Rights era. It's a society deeply segregated. Yet I'd turn on the television set and I would watch Star Trek, and I'd see a world, a future that was fully integrated, that was multicultural, that had Russian characters on in the midst of the Cold War, that had an Asian American character on well before most television was paying attention, had the first interracial kiss on American television. So Star Trek for me represented a philosophical alternative to the world I was living in. And as I got into high school and early college, I found my way into the world of fandom, people who were eager to discuss the ideas, not just around Star Trek, but science fiction more generally, who were creating zines and publishing their own stories, who were beginning, as we got deeper into the 80s, to be using VCRs and patch cords to re-edit footage and mash up video together in new ways. So when I went off to graduate school, I fully expected simply to be exploring media, to be exploring the text and the authors. But what I rapidly discovered was all kinds of claims being made about the public by media scholars that simply didn't gel with the experiences I'd had as a fan. And I think we now look back and see that fans were the shock truth, the early adopters and adapters of these technologies who were experimenting with virtual communities as early as the first part of the 20th century, who were early users of blogs and video blogs and podcasts and all of these other technologies. And so by following the fans wherever they went, I found myself writing about policy, about creation, about technology, about law, about politics, about education. Each step along the way, the fan community has been ahead of me in trying to understand what it means to live in a fully participatory culture.
And I can imagine your expectations, as you said, when you got to grad school, was that you'd do a certain thing and so on. Was there a conflict, and how did you negotiate it, between being an academic and a fan?
Well, I think that the line is less sharp now than it was when I began. I mean, we use this term acafan to describe people who are both academics and fans. And that's a term that I use on my blog, Confessions. An acafan, there's now a whole tribe of us, lots of academics whose roots are in fandom, who understand participatory culture through that lens. When I was starting, there weren't a lot of us, and there was a tendency to be distrustful, to sort of accuse us of slumming it, of this is something we're putting on, pretending to be of the people when we're like other academics who come from elite backgrounds. There was disbelief.
Who was making that accusation?
Well, I think everything from the sort of what limited press covers the academic world, places like Chronicle of Higher Education, and those kinds of publications were suspicious of it. And other academics for whom popular culture is not their natural taste, right? That they've defined their identity as someone above the popular.
Right.
And I'm very much of popular culture. I love the lowest of the low, and I feel a really strong sense of commonality with the people who consume it. And I think that those groups often get misunderstood by people who project a lot onto those audiences, their own distaste and anxiety about mass media. You know,
you mentioned Star Trek as really a formative fulcrum almost for how you approached all this stuff. Star Trek and the Star Trek conventions and all of that sort of thing is something everyone knows about. When you were saying that, just your answer, I was thinking, if I were to think of who the most intense fans prior to that were, it probably was soap opera fans. Now, did they, with more primitive technologies, do any of the kinds of things that we now associate with active fan?
Yeah, Sam Ford, my co-author on Spreadable Media, has edited a book on the future of soap opera. And the book goes back and talks about soap opera fans as people who pooled knowledge and shared information, that soap opera was deeply embedded in in families and became a source of bonding for multiple generations of women through whom they discussed their values and their commitments. They cast judgments, on the characters, and the process learned how each other thought about the world. Soaps from the very beginning explored the ethics of business, gender relations, later issues of sexuality, and fans were very much used them as an entry point into those conversations. Soaps moved too fast to produce a lot of fan fiction or even fan conventions, right? Let's Star Trek, right. You have 20 episodes a season or 24, 25 in the early 60s. Soaps, you have, 300 so episodes a year.
However repetitious they may be,
it's still hard to find the space to write between those things.
Yeah.
So there's no stable point from which to write fan fiction. In the age of the internet, you start to see other interventions by fans, and soap fans have certainly been fighting to keep the genre alive. There's the time that they're in danger of more and more of them being canceled.
Well, I mean, it's funny. I hadn't thought about this until we're sitting here, but there's a current conflict going on, right? Someone wants to take One Life to Live and one of the others that have been canceled and rebirth them online, and they're having a fight with whether it's the studios, the producers, someone.
And my bet is if we have soap fans in the audience, they're following that very, very closely and are very actively involved in the stakes of what this means for the future of the medium. So Sam's book, The Future of Soap Operas, is really worth checking out. He was predicting some of these shifts a few years back and has followed it very, very closely.
Yeah, I will just tell you, I was an actor for years, and the two things I probably got recognized the most for were my one appearance on Star Trek because of their enormous devotion, and my about a year on Young and the Restless. And the two of them are the thing where, for when I was on those, that's where I got recognized. The other thing I must say about Young and the Restless, given what you were saying about how they reckoned with gender issues, is that Young and the Restless, by far the most popular soap opera for 2 decades, is the one, as I look at it, that has the most attention paid to the black community. Of its central characters, black families are just as prominent as white families, and it stood them in very good stead.
Yeah, I think that's a classic example of where soap operas we may dismiss as the lowest of low, but in fact they do important cultural work and maybe important political work and shaping the way people see themselves, see the world around them, and begin to develop a sense of power.
Yeah.
You know, I mentioned soap fans rallying to save the show. If you think about fans doing any kind of letter writing campaign to keep a program on the air, by the time they've identified who the pressure points are, who makes the decisions, what's the tactics, how do you identify people, mobilize them, educate them, get them out there and rallying, you've done everything that an activist campaign needs to be. And so we're now seeing more and more these fan movements becoming activist movements, working not just to keep a show on the air, but to make its vision realized in the real world. So if you're looking for how to build a better society, I would say fandoms represent a really important model right now for thinking about what culture in the future might look like.
What do you mean? We've talked about it, but I'd love you to give me, your like most concrete definition, if you will, of participatory culture.
So participatory culture is one where more and more people have access to the means of production and circulation, right? And I now would probably use the phrase a more participatory culture just to signal all the people who are being left behind, all of the obstacles to achieving it. Right now, participatory culture for most of us is still a goal we're fighting to achieve. But the goal, what we're seeing is around at least the developed world, is a growing percentage of people have the ability to create media and to spread media, to share media with other people. Much of my earlier work was on creating media. Spreadable media is really about this process of circulation. Right. So in the book, we start with this distinction between distribution, which is what companies have always done, the top-down flow of media content, and circulation, which is increasingly a hybrid system, which we play an active role. So the example we use in the front of the book is the Susan Boyle video, which jumped from Britain's Got Talent across the Atlantic, was seen by hundreds of thousands of people on YouTube by the time it was done, and when her album released, it outsold Whitney Houston to the U.S. market. We've now surpassed that with Cooney 2012, right? Last year's Cooney 2012, the producers Invisible Children down in San Diego estimated reach 500,000 people over a 2-month period of time, and instead it reached 70 million people over a 4-day period of time. So you could take the highest rated show on American television, the highest grossing film in the box office that week, add it together and double it, and you start to approach the number of people who saw this 30-minute documentary about child soldiers in Africa in 4 days period of time. We're now seeing Gangnam Style starting to gain on it in terms of the speed and scope. So there we're seeing more international content flow into the market. So if we think about what happened with Susan Boyle, what happened with Cooney 2012, what's happened in Gangnam Style, this is really shaking up how media travels through the culture, and it's done so in a participatory way insofar as it's not a key decision maker in some corporate media conglomerate deciding that we see this, but rather individuals passing along to us, and it spreads across a variety of networks in very active ways. I'm
going to read a quote of yours. We could argue that participation as a concept has been stretched to cover so much that it is losing its value as a distinction from other forms of consumption. And in my field, this is you again, there are more and more calls for a new nuanced vocabulary for describing and appraising different forms of participation. Now, in other words, what I'm imagining is this whole notion of participatory culture is like the tip of the iceberg to most people. They sort of get a sense of that. But as you've dug into this, what are you talking about here?
Well, let's take the example of YouTube, which is a platform that certainly sells itself as deeply participatory, that uses the slogan broadcast yourself, that we upload content to. On one level, it's not at all participatory. We get no say in the governance of Google, the corporation, which owns YouTube. We have things can be taken down without our permission. It's certainly not a very supportive community. If you read the comments after YouTube videos, they're incredibly harsh, particularly to minority perspectives. It really does not support collective governance over the core technology or the core corporate interests involved. On the other hand, a team of researchers involving my USC colleagues and students have looked at YouTube in relation to the Occupy movement. Right, and they found hundreds of thousands of videos posted on YouTube from Occupy supporters. some of which were intended to travel far, some of which were intended just to be a dumping ground, an archive, a space where people shared media with other Occupy sites.
Right. You didn't make it to this demonstration. Here's what happened.
Here's what you're seeing. Lots of different uses going on there. We could contrast that, say, with Fox News, right? Fox News doesn't give us any say over the governance of Fox News, but it also doesn't allow us access to the capacity to share messages. And we know Fox News quite early on did almost no coverage of the Occupy movement until it was deeply rooted. So there is more space for Occupy or any other progressive group to communicate through YouTube than it is through a traditional broadcast. But we then want to fight over the questions of governance and control over our content that are created around any Web 2.0 company. We write a lot in the book about how Web 2.0 promises us greater participation than we actually achieve.
Okay, we'll talk about that a little bit more. But you brought up Occupy. One of the things that I noticed, and certainly people noted, was that in the very first instance, really, and it was recreated here in L.A., I think, the streaming, the instantaneous streaming of the demonstrations, of the occupations, was attributed as much as anything else to their growth, to their being able to have instant growth. Could you talk just a little bit about that?
Yeah, I think it's part of the overall process. I mean, what's interesting about Occupy is it's not so much a movement as a provocation. Occupy wanted to change the way Americans thought about the distribution of wealth. It wanted to embed that 99%, 1% distinction as a way of processing something many of us knew existed, but hadn't mobilized before. And I would argue, playing on Malcolm X, it does so by any medium necessary, right? It does so by taking whatever the available platform is. So it does streaming stuff. It uses social media. It borrows fan cultural references. So we have Occupy Sesame Street. 99% of the cookies belong to 1% of the monsters. When I visited Occupy in New York, there was a busload of zombies who were horror fans from the fan convention getting on, and people were videotaping them, spreading them out. They remixed images for the pepper spray cop to sort of spread across the internet. All of that gave us ongoing media coverage, ways of connecting the Occupy story, even when it wasn't getting a lot of mainstream media coverage, and create a space for places like Pacifica and NPR to pick up on the story, to carry it more deeply, to dig into it. And I think this is the way alternative political movements are going to operate at the present time.
Was this the first or just the biggest sort of instance of the two coming together like this?
I think it's the biggest one here. I mean, one of the things we're tracing is the Dreamer movement, the young undocumented youth in support of the DREAM Act. And they've been incredibly effective at using video, live web streaming, social media to get their message out. They recognized quite early on that most Americans didn't know they knew anyone who was undocumented. And I put it that way because you probably did, but they were closeted. So coming out of the closet as undocumented, turning the video camera on yourself and telling your story and putting it on YouTube became part of the tactic for young people.
It's interesting. I got an email within the last 24, 48 hours from the legalized drugs movement, I'm not sure if it was from Drug Policy Alliance or anything, and it basically had a video that said, have this conversation, and was basically inviting the same thing, that people don't know who already smokes marijuana. People don't, because people have stayed in the closet, inviting people to...
Yeah, so coming out of the closet in the age of YouTube has become an important metaphor. And those videos may not get seen by more than 1,000 people or whatever, but 1,000 here, 1,000 there are getting a message in a much more immediate way than ever before. The Dreamers also did the live web streaming stuff in very effective ways. So acts of civil disobedience, young people were going into INS immigration headquarters across the South and turning themselves in as undocumented, webcasting the whole thing until they're stopped, right? And then they had videos ready to go up that if you see this video, it means I've been cut off. This is my story. And it was a very effective example of 21st century civil disobedience.
Very good. How did this book happen? The book we're talking about is Spreadable Media, Creating Value and Meaning in a Networked Culture. And I love the subtitle. In other words, spreadable media can mean many things to many people. But when you actually say we're talking about creating value and meaning, then I go, okay, this is, there's something on the plate here.
Yeah, I mean, it started because after my book Convergence Culture came out 6-7 years ago. And there was a discussion already starting between media industries around this book. And I thought, how do I engage them? I want to reform the media industry. I think that a lot of the policies they have toward their consumer base are unfair, they're exploitative, they're manipulative. I want to go after corporatized media, but I had the ear of corporate media. So what do I take advantage of that? At that time at MIT, we particularly had a bully pulpit to speak about new technology. So we created a space where industry leaders came together with my students, with other academics, to have conversations. What should media policy look like?
And that was the Convergence Culture Consortium?
Convergence Culture Consortium. So Joshua and Sam and I were all part of that group. So around this book, we have about 30 essays online that discuss various aspects of the topic at the spreadablemedia.org website. And all of those people are either former students or colleagues who are part of this larger conversation. So at a certain point, we said, let's get that conversation down on paper, get the book out, and spread the conversation. So this is a book, in part, a progressive discourse addressed at media industries. It's also addressed at media fans, but it's also full of ideas, I think, that activists and social change agents should be aware of, because there are new opportunities now for independent artists, for activists, for civic media producers, for religious media producers in a spreadable media age. So we're trying to harness that knowledge and make it available to anyone who wants to reshape the agenda of the media that we're surrounded by all the time.
So as I said in my intro, how might this change the way and influence the way you expand your influence and impact as an individual, as a community, is to the point.
Yeah, absolutely. You can read parts of it are very clearly addressed in industry. My two colleagues, Sam Ford is in the PR industry, Joshua Green's in the advertising industry. But I think it offers a lot to the kinds of people who listen to Pacifica Radio, who want to get involved, who want to change the world, to think about media power in new ways, not to live in a world where corporate media has a monopoly and we're locked out of it, and the only way to respond is to jam the signal, which is the metaphor of the 90s, culture jamming.
Right.
Instead, to do what Andrew Slack of the Harry Potter Alliance calls cultural acupuncture, put pressure on those points in society where things are circulating, right? To change the flow of media, to call attention to things that are important to us. And we may be very critical, say, of what CUNY 2012 had to say. It's kind of white saviorism.
Mm-hmm.
There are lots of left critiques of CUNY 2012. I get them. But at the end of the day, if we could learn how to do what those guys did, in terms of getting the news media of the society to pay attention to a set of concerns in Africa that no one was paying attention to previously, then that's something that we all should want to know how to do as we fight for the various policy concerns that drive us. So just as Lawrence Lessig will say, if you have one concern, fight for it. If you have a second concern, should be campaign finance reform. Maybe the third concern should be media literacy, right? The thing that we all need to have in order to use this communication system more effectively.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think it was following the 2004 election, might even have been the 2000, that I said what it seemed to me we needed was a restored democracy trifecta: election reform, media reform, and campaign finance reform. And without those three legs, democracy is really is really not real.
And I would say media reform has two legs of its own. One is control over concentration, regulation,
right, which is the easy thing that you sort of people
and that's
say, well,
the
what
thing
do you
everyone
mean?
Gets that, right? Because that allows you to be anti-corporate, to go after and have the feel good of sort of. But the other side, on the harder part in a way, is media literacy education. How do we ensure the skills and knowledge necessary to meaningfully change the media environment gets dispersed evenly across the population? How do we ensure that the lowest of the low don't get there? And that's what inspired me so much about the Dreamers. Was we were interviewing bloggers who had no access to who didn't have their own computers.
What, they go to the library?
They go to the library and blog from the library. They maybe get a mobile phone and learn to thumb their way in to get their blogs. We were talking to people who made movies for YouTube and had to borrow cameras from community centers in order to do it. These are some of the shrewdest young people in terms of understanding how new media works, but they're locked out of access to that technology. And the skills they had were community-based skills, not individual skills, right? Some of them grew out of trying to simply create videos of what was happening in L.A. and send them back to their families in Mexico or Latin America or Iran or wherever they're from. That sense of just community connection started to give them some of the skills that they turned into making political change. So these are inspirational stories we see all around us, but there are so many people who don't have access to the technology or have limited access to the technology. They have access to the schools, but the schools have blocked social media, blogging technology, mandatory filtering, or they have access to the technology, but they don't have mentorship around them, people who can help them acquire the skills, know how to navigate the space. So spreadability is a skill set, right? It's understanding how we actively take control of the circulation of media and the culture and how we get our messages out so they get seen by more people.
Okay, that's the voice of Henry Jenkins. I'm Terrence McNally, and we're talking about the ideas in his new book with Sam Ford and Joshua Green, Spreadable Media, Creating Value and Meaning in a Networked Culture. And you can learn more at henryjenkins.org or spreadablemedia.org. I got to ask you one question. With what you talked about, when I asked you about how the book happened, the Convergence Culture Consortium, the empowering relationships between you and graduate students and so on, how hard was it to leave and come out to USC?
It was challenging, I have to say. I had been at MIT for 20 years during the peak of the digital revolution, but there was something that called me to be out here to be involved in the conversations that this community is having right now. And some of those are the conversations Hollywood's having and mass media is having as it catches up with this participatory change. You know, how do we shift power within the corporations? How do we create more openness there? Some of the conversations Los Angeles is having, right? I talked about the Dreamers in this interview. And so there's a lot of new forms of activism going on in the streets of Los Angeles now, and I wanted to be part of that. And then some of it is Annenberg itself and USC more generally as a university that's thinking about the future, that's asking hard questions, that's bringing smart people together, and is training the next generation of people in the media so that we have some influence over what happens next.
Very interesting. I mean, I can imagine also one piece probably was just to shake your own life up.
Oh, for sure. You got to change periodically. And this has been so rejuvenating for me. I've knocked out 3 books in the last 4 years since I've been here, and they're all things I was thinking and working on at MIT, but I needed to clear my head and get to the point that I get those ideas down.
That's interesting. I know a quote from Benjamin Franklin, when you're finished changing, you're finished.
That's right. If you're not moving, you're dying. And
that's right. Busy being born or busy dying.
Exactly.
Dylan. Briefly, how did the three of you collaborate on the book? Because I'm sure whenever people hear 3 authors to a book, it sounds challenging.
It was, and we didn't always get along, but I think that we all 3 had worked together for several years when we started the process. We sort of heard each other's voice. We had been involved in a conversation over a period of time. And we used something as basic as Google Docs. We were in 3 different places in our lives and geography and industry. We were writing and asynchronously on Google Docs, rewriting each other's stuff, working it through paragraph by paragraph, sentence by sentence. And we just went through the book so many times that it became a blend of our 3 voices. I mean, I'm involved in another conversational book right now with Dana Boyd and Mimi Ito and I on participatory culture. And all 3 of us have worked together as well. But this one will be a straight-out conversation. Each of us are writing separate paragraphs, responding to each other. We sat in a room with a tape recorder and all discussed things for a long weekend and then used that to seed for the book. And that's been a very different process of collaboration. But both of them will produce, I think, books that push forward our understanding of what participatory culture looks like.
Well, I'm fascinated, actually, by the process of collaboration, and I'm reminded of 2 different books. One, the books that John Brockman does, where the New Humanist and the Third Culture and so on, where he takes all of these people on cutting-edge science, interviews one of them, and then puts it out there and has everyone else comment on the interview, which ends up adding so much, especially when you're dealing with a cutting-edge thing. And I mean, a book is kind of the static example of what's actually going on online all the time.
Yeah, so I mean, the book, we have the book. We wanted from the beginning the book to be a conversation. So we invited 30 of our closest friends to write pieces we respond to in the book, but that exist on the web, and those circulate freely around the book, and we've encouraged people to pick them up in their blogs, to react to them. We really see this as starting as a conversation. We're sort of trying to put into practice the philosophy of the book. And part of that philosophy is the world's too complex for individual experts, right? We live in a society which requires collective expertise and multidisciplinary knowledge of us bringing together what we all know and talking it through together online in a deliberative way. So at the end of the day, we come up with solutions that none of us would have thought of on our own. And I think that's really how we are going to have to confront the problems of the 21st century, and it's how academia should be working.
And how much is that true?
Oh, I think to a large degree, my academics still think as lone wolves. We still want to be the experts. We want to be the sage on the stage.
And their grad students.
Yes, one person and their grad students who does a lot of the research. And then we put our name on the top of it and sell it. But I think more and more collaboration is what we have to be embracing.
Yeah.
And so I rarely tackle any project now that I don't bring a bunch of different experts in the room, grad students and faculty from different disciplines, and really try to pool that knowledge together to get us someplace we wouldn't do if we just stayed within our own little groove.
What I heard that's interesting in that, Henry Jenkins, is that, you basically, according to the titles and things, you're talking about media, but in fact, it's the very participatory nature of authorship is going on.
Absolutely. And I think all of my books now have some digital extension. So even thinking of them as a book is a misnomer, right? If a book is a printed object,
right.
Because we're experimenting with how do we use the web to make it more up to date, to make it create more space
Fluid,
for conversation,
dynamic.
to bring media, and how to write about media with a static form like print, as opposed to bringing clips and segments of media together as part of what we do. And so, yeah, I think the book itself and what publishing means, what writing means, will change fundamentally as we get deeper into a networked culture.
I'm Terrence McNally. That's the voice of Henry Jenkins. We're talking about his new book, Spreadable Media, Creating Value and Meaning in a Networked Culture. You can learn more at henryjenkins.org and spreadablemedia.org. This is Freeforum. You can visit me at terrencemcnally.net, TERRENCEMCNALLY, terrencemcnally.net, or aworldthatjustmightwork.com. They're the same website. And you can learn more there about the show, guest podcast transcripts, about my work with story and narrative within organizations. You can also listen to podcasts there or at iTunes. You can sign up there at iTunes to have the podcast delivered weekly. You can also sign up there or email me at TEMcNally, TEMCNALLY, TEMcNally@mac.com to get a weekly email telling you who's going to be on, what we're going to talk about, and 3 or 4 articles of background. You can also check out Freeforum with Terrence McNally on Facebook and follow me on Twitter at McNallyTerrence. Your Twitter is?
It's just Henry Jenkins.
Henry Jenkins, very good. Okay, you talked about redefining the book. You also, in the book, talk about redefining some of the other terms, viral, user-generated. Let's talk about viral first of all.
Yeah, so the word viral is really an infection-based metaphor, right? I mean, by definition, and we argue in the book it's a way of people who've always had power to maintain the illusion of being in control at a moment of radical change. Right, so the idea of the viral is you design the killer virus, it infects its host, the host carries it back to the village like a smallpox-infected blanket, and it kills off the rest of the population. We become unknowing carriers of self-replicating information, and that's the rhetoric that surrounds the viral very often. And that allows inside the industry for people either to be sort of throw up their hands and say, I have no idea what happened, it just went viral, or people just claim, if you give me a lot of money, I'll tell you how to make your content go viral. All of that strips aside human agency. We believe when you look at CUNY 2012 or Susan Boyle or any of these stories that spread widely, that lots of people were actively involved, made decisions.
Yeah.
In our inbox every day, we get many, many pieces of media. We pass along a much fewer number of those pieces of media. We often learn about the world because people pass media to us that we trust, that we value their relationships to. So as we make the decision about which media to pass to whom, through which network, in which community, around which conversation, with which message intact, and whether we alter that content or not, whether we pick a phrase like binders of women and amplify it through our communication practices, these are not viral. We're not helpless in that. We're very actively making choices. And the more we become conscious of the choices we're making, the more we can exert power that start to shape the agenda of the society.
So what word do you folks...
Well, we sort of throw out the word spreadable. We know it reminds people of peanut butter and jam and all of that. It's kind of a silly word. But the point is it's a placeholder until we all figure out what works best. What's good about the word spreadable is it does emphasize the activity of spreading. Spreading is something we do. It's not something that happens to us. And it emphasizes that content is being spread, not just sort of bits of memes that are circulating through the human bloodstream, so to speak. So I think that's where we're at right now, but we're open to other explorations. What's important for us is that attention to the conscious choices communities are making about what media they pass along to each other, and particularly people making ethical and informed choices about that. Right? If we believe that we're responsible for shaping the media agenda by our choices to pass things along, then we should take ownership over the information we pass along. We shouldn't be passing along rumors and hate speech and all kinds of idiocy that we pass along.
I see what you're saying,
regularly.
that the more that we disabuse ourselves of the notion that it's viral, that it's magical, then we realize, oh, we are the agent. So now, since I'm the responsible party, how can I be more responsible?
What choices am I making about what to pass on, and how do I use that power to create a society, as you say, that might just work, right? How do we bring about a more workable society by the choices about media that we spread along? And I think that's a crucial part of the choices we're making. And we're again and again given messages that it doesn't matter. So there was an article that's been making the rounds lately about the Harlem Shake that's sort of saying, you didn't make this, the corporations made it, right? Which is to say, it starts with a piece of corporate media. Various points along the way, certain companies encourage their employees to make videos, but nonprofit groups made that, education groups made that, political groups made that, individuals made that, networks made that. So it acts as if the only choices were it went viral, it sort of mysteriously traveled, or a corporation controlled its distribution. And in fact, it's a hybrid. It's all of those things mixed together. And so take ownership over those parts that you can exert some control over and use them toward the causes and things you believe in, but make sure that you're not polluting the mental landscape by circulating information that you know is false or you haven't checked out. Check your facts.
Yeah. So what do you mean by what has become, as I've researched, looking at the book, looking at what people say about the book and so on, the line, if it doesn't spread, it's dead. What does that mean?
Well, essentially, a lot of the impulses of media producers are the lockdown content, right? The metaphor we use on the cover of the book is the dandelion. And Cory Doctorow, the science fiction writer, says that one of the problems our current regimes of intellectual property is we're thinking like mammals. And mammals reproduce a small number of times. You always want to know where your children is, and you don't want anyone taking your children away without your permission. So we think of our ideas as our brain children. And he says, what if we thought of our ideas like a dandelion that produces endless spores and the wind takes them and blows it everywhere? Dandelions are never going to be an endangered species, even though they control what happens to their seeds. The seeds simply travel and they take roots and they grow under a wide variety of conditions. So if we think of content as gaining meaning and value as people take it up and insert it into other conversations, our goal should be to ensure that it spreads, not to lock down and possess it. And I think that's the philosophical shift we're pushing toward. In that sense, we're challenging companies that have made money off of charging for access to their contents and have blamed any kind of grassroots circulation, has called it piracy, to suspend judgment long enough to figure out in what ways they may benefit from us passing content along to each other. Certainly, if I produced the Susan Boyle video and Susan's albums outsell Whitney Houston's, I benefited commercially from it. If I'm Invisible Children and I wanted my video to get out to the world, it benefited up to a point in that wide circulation, up to the point that the circulation became so intense that it overwhelmed them, shut down their servers, crushed them, and resulted in a nervous breakdown, right? They got much more success than they asked for. But up until that point, as a nonprofit, the idea that your ideas spread that far and got that much support would be phenomenal. So we're trying to push back on this desire to control, to regulate, to shut down, to lock away your content, and instead spread it and let it live.
You have said that piracy is a market failure.
Yeah, I think as much as a moral failure, it's a failure to anticipate consumer desire, if we're going to put it in the language of capitalism, right? using a recent example of Downton Abbey, which is a PBS show lots of your listeners no doubt watch and enjoy. Downton Abbey airs in Great Britain last fall. It doesn't air in the U.S. until early spring, right? So there's a 6-month gap, more or less, from when the episodes air, during which time the public wants access to these stories. Information is leaking out. There's online conversations going on, during which time BitTorrent is copying the hell out of Downton Abbey. Soon it's available on iTunes legally. Soon the DVD comes out, and only the people, the last to know, are those people who watched it legally on PBS, right? So piracy in that case was a failure of the market to anticipate the demands people had for this content, or to serve the desire.
Yeah,
yes.
Yeah.
They knew the desire. In this case, they knew the demand
Right.
was there. They simply felt locked into old habits.
They had a plan, and
so almost anyone I know who liked Downton Abbey, all the shocking cliffhangers were spoiled before they got to that point in the series, because the information is circulating more freely. Whereas if you simply accelerated that process and made that material available earlier in the process, piracy would go down in a lot of cases. When we interview people, it's not like they want content just because it's free in most cases. It's they're making calculations about, what are the cost benefits of different ways of accessing content. And people are sharing content internationally. There's a desire for international content that's underserved by media companies. We're starting to see Hulu and iTunes and some of the others pick up global television series and do fairly well by them. But it's a very, very recent development compared to, say, the exchange of television content by immigrant groups and international fans that's been going on for as long as we've had networked communication.
Right. That's Henry Jenkins. We're talking about spreadable media, creating value and meaning in a network culture. This is Freeforum. I'm Terrence McNally. You also have a problem with the term user-generated content, which, that one sounds great.
Well, we can start with the word content, since the word content literally means that which is contained. And if you follow the philosophy of the book, content is no longer contained. So by definition, is no longer content, right? It's something else. Content also has been historically tied to this commodification. It's something we buy rather than information we engage with, relationships we participate in. The user-generated implies that our primary relationship is to the company that produces the content, right? It defines us as YouTube users rather than as members of all kinds of communities that might choose YouTube as an archive base. So we talked about Occupy. When I'm an Occupy movement person who archives an encampment and puts it on YouTube, am I simply a user generating content for YouTube, or is YouTube a tool that I'm using in my activism? If I'm an educator putting content out for my students, if I'm fans sharing media with each other, all of the practices are better understood in relation to the communities that they're part of, what motivates them. And as a last resort, let's fall back on this notion of user to define what that relationship looks like.
Right. In other words, as I hear you saying, people normally, when they say user-generated, you're using YouTube, but in fact, but it's the use of YouTube that actually gives you the power.
Yeah, it's what we do with it, I think, that's important. It's sort of like referring to yourself as a renter, right? On certain relationships, if you have an apartment, you're a renter, but it's probably not your primary identification of what you're doing all day long. Come home at the end of the day and you say to your wife, it's good renting this place. That's probably not the first thing in your mind. You're having your life, you're doing things. The fact you're a renter is maybe important to the landlord relationship.
And once a month.
And nothing else, right? So calling us a user implies a very different relationship to that content than just describing it as something that emerges from a community in the course of its ordinary social and cultural interactions.
You make a distinction between participatory culture and Web 2.0. Now, I have to confess, I've never been sure exactly what even Web 2.0 meant. So could you take us through the evolution? Web 1.0, Web 2.0, and what's emerging now?
All right, so if we use the language of Web 1.0, Web 1.0 referred to that moment of the dot-com boom and then bust, right? That was the first history of the web. It's a term that refers to technology. It refers to corporate relations. It's a business model. Web 2.0 emerges from the collapse of the dot-coms. It represents social media. It represents so-called user-generated content. It's a more participatory model of how these platforms are going to operate. It's a more networked model of how these platforms are going to operate. it is still, at the end of the day, a business model. So if I look at participatory culture, its history goes back hundreds of years, right? There's a long-standing practice of folk production. My grandmother was a remix artist. She was a quilter in Appalachia. Right, she took bits of cloth, someone else produced, she stitched it together.
Used to be a skirt, used to be a drape, and now it's a,
She's remixed the content of the textile companies of the American South, and she created something. She learned how to do it within a community of other people who were made quilts, right? She learned from other women in an informal system. They were often given as gifts. They're not content, not user-generated content. They're community-based crafts, right, at that point. So if we think that as part of a larger history of people making culture together, sharing culture with each other, telling stories to each other, that history is much older than the history of these platforms and these companies. So what Web 2.0 does is tries to capture a certain percentage of that participatory culture and commodify it, finds a way to make money off of our desire to participate.
As much as anything, by the way, it defines certain things.
Exactly. It defines, it sets the terms of our participation.
Yeah.
It offers us tools we can use and networks we can join, but at the price of commodifying what it is we produce. So it's like taking the quilt my grandmother made and giving to a young couple as they're getting married and saying, no, you should charge for that. Well, actually, more to the point, we're going to take that, we're going to make money off of it, and we may or may not give you a percentage of the money we make off of that exchange.
You're leading to my next question, which is that social networking sites are laying claim to users' content. These are your words. In part as a way to make it harder to shift between platforms, to weaken our ability to resist other terms of service, which we might otherwise unacceptable. What's going on here, and what's the response to it?
So if I bring all of my friendship networks to Facebook or MyFace or or MySpace or one of the, any new platform, right? So I bring all my friends there. We put our content there. We form our social relations there. I don't own that content. In fact, if you look at the small print on your user terms, they own that content. So I can't take that content and carry it someplace else if I'm unsatisfied, right? It's like going to a bar, and if you're unsatisfied with the service and the policies of the bar, you can't take your bunch of buddies and go down the street and drink someplace else, right? You're locked in. Or you have to sacrifice all of that history, all that content you've shared, and start anew someplace
with a new
else.
group of friends. Yeah.
So it's a policy that makes it very, very difficult once we put our content into that space to move it, to control it. And it means that they can impose, different privacy policies, different claims of content, different monetization schemes, and we're going to stick with it because it's more trouble to move than it is to put up with whatever change conditions they're involved with. So it takes away our power to fight for governance over the platforms that affect our social interactions.
And what's happening these days in that contest? Well,
I think it's up for grabs still, I would say. That I think if the language of Web 2.0 implied there was an absolute identity between the interests of producers and consumers.
Right.
That's not what's happened. There are conflicting interests. Every platform has had, network struggles over the terms of service. If you're in any social media platform for very long, you're going to be solicited on one side or another in a fight over privacy, advertising, all of the policies that affect your life. People aren't taking it sitting down. I think, the news is they feel a stake in these communities, and they're fighting for them. But companies have continually found new schemes and new approaches, which makes it very difficult for us to control the kinds of lives we want to live in these online platforms. And there are various efforts to create alternative platforms that might be more popularly controlled, that might be programmed by grassroots communities and so forth, but they lack the critical mass that makes these social media platforms so effective. That it's the fact that all the people from all different aspects of your life are there, that your old friends from high school can find you on Facebook. If you moved into the People's platform, the odds are your fellow progressives might be there, but your in-laws wouldn't be, and your high school friends wouldn't be. And
which is that other thing that's going on in terms of the distributive media, the networks and so on, that we find that people get echo chamber, which one of the pluses of these broad things like Facebook is you don't necessarily get the echo chamber. I have conservative friends, I have old friends, I have young friends.
Yeah, so I think this is another advantage of a spreadable media, is ideas spread from one community to another. Conversations unfold as media spreads across the culture. The more we lock down the content, the more we lock down the conversations and lock out other voices that we should be listening to.
Let me ask you about This year's TED Prize of $1 million and a lot of publicity and cooperation so on went to Sugata Mitra for his work on what he calls souls, which are self-organizing learning environments, just to fill in the blanks for people. He put a computer screen, a computer keyboard in a hole in a wall in a slum in India, and within hours returned, and within hours the kids who had gravitated toward it because of its novelty were surfing the web. And then he did it in a more rural, and so now he's had success with that, and that's his vision. How does that sort of thing, where does that fit into what you're talking about?
Well, that's about expanding technical access first and foremost, right? It's about getting the tools into people's hands. And that's an absolutely necessary part of the struggle. That's a struggle we've been involved in around the digital divide in the U.S. for 20 years. And we're to the point where 95% of American youth have some kind of access to networked technology. 95%. Okay. The remaining 5%, some are people who've chosen actively not to access for a variety of reasons. The Amish say that some of them are people on Native American reservations that don't even have phone service yet. So the 5% that's left are going to be really difficult to close. So We're at a point where people have access. Now, a lot of those people have access through schools and public libraries where there's all kinds of restrictions on their use of that technology that limits their ability to do it. But as we get to that point, technological access is not the primary issue at the moment. It's access to knowledge, to skills, to mentorship, to a sense of entitlement or empowerment, the ability to participate. So the research that's been done in art museums says if you make the art museum free, you still get mostly upper middle class patrons, right? It's not about price. It's about who feels comfortable entering an art museum, who feels they belong there, who has the knowledge to allow them to access. So if we have access to free technology and free information, there's still a percentage of people who don't have the literacy skills and the social capacities to meaningfully move into that space. So it's no accident you put a computer in a rural area in India, people will do the first step, which is learning how to surf the web. But the next stuff, the stuff about using that to effectively communicate their political concerns, to participate in online communities, those kinds of things are skills that have to be acquired, and they're acquired in a much more complex way. And that's where economic inequalities start to enter in. If you're middle class in society, you have access to people all around you who know how to use the technology effectively to serve your interests. If you're lower class, you may be the only person in your family who's ever been online. You may not have, adults who you can turn to for advice when you get harassed in an online community or when you're trying to decide the ethics of which content to pass along. All of those kinds of questions, you simply don't have the resources. You go to school and you're seen as needy because you're asking for all that help all at once that your middle class classmates get throughout the day. Right. You're suddenly desperate for that information. And so you're treated as behind when in fact you simply lack access to the social economic resources to enable you to meaningfully participate. So getting access to the technology, as the Hole in the Wall project does, is a key part of the problem, particularly in India where the digital divide is still very, very significant. But here, the challenge is about media literacy education and how to give people those social skills and cultural competencies they need to become meaningful participants and not simply to access the technology.
You've been paying attention to media, to communities, to students in your various roles. I've been playing around with a notion that I call 60s 2.0. Silly name, but my notion is that values and perspectives that emerged or were popular in the 60s, things like community, sharing, questioning the primacy of competition and consumption, learning from nature, questioning authority, emerged in the 60s, and that they are emergent again in young people today. But second, that something about the internet, something about this whole conversation we're talking about, transparency, access, collaboration, will make it more difficult for the dominant culture to reject, dismiss, or marginalize those values this time around. Your thoughts?
I think it's absolutely true. I think, historians will tell us there was a movement of values from the counterculture to the cyberculture, right? And you could trace it in particular individuals. Timothy Leary, for example, would be someone who moved from being a key figure of the 60s counterculture to an early advocate Tom Hayden would be another one who made that. Stuart Brand. So that trajectory is there. The language of participation is to be found in documents like the Port Huron Manifesto, which is a key document of the counterculture, the anti-war movement of the 1960s. So those ideas were already there, and were carried with the technology into the cyberculture we're at today. It's baked into the basic code of the web is this notion of grassroots community, dispersed communication, commons. All of those ideas have been there all along, and even though there's a layer of corporate control that's trying to rein that in, the corporations have to work differently because of those cultural values in place, and they're still failing to convert us to being good little corporate citizens. We're fighting back tooth and nail over terms of service that limit those core sets of values. Similarly, the slogan of the 60s was the whole world is watching. And that was more a hope than a reality. That is, if you could get CBS, NBC, and ABC to pay attention to your protest, then the whole world would be aware of it. There's no place in the web where the whole world is watching, but we don't need CBS, NBC, and ABC to get your message out, right? You have the capacity through these spreadable media channels to get ideas out. If not the whole world is watching,
the whole world can see.
The whole world can see. And we've seen that with movements in one part of the world spread rapidly, whether it's the Arab Spring movements moving across the Middle East or whether it's the Occupy movement moving from the U.S. to Europe to Latin America. We're seeing these things travel not through broadcast means, but through networked means of people learning from each other, connecting to each other, and so forth. And that makes it much harder to contain the kinds of movements that emerged in the 1960s.
So, in other words, you not only share my sort of appraisal and kind of getting this feeling, but you also think that we've got a better shot at these things becoming sustainable as values, sustainable as principles.
I do. It doesn't mean we won the battle. It's still going to be a struggle, and we're still dealing with, lots of corporate forces, lots of reactionary forces, lots of blockages. But I think we have more hope now than we've ever had before.
Okay. Again, the book is Spreadable Media, Creating Value and Meaning in a Networked Culture. The websites are henryjenkins.org and spreadablemedia.org. Thank you to Henry Jenkins.
Thanks
Keep
for
up
being
your
here.
good work. You can listen to this week's conversation and many others anytime during the week by listening to the podcast. You can sign up to have it delivered to you weekly. You can do both of those things at iTunes or at my site. For podcast articles and transcripts of interviews, to join me in pursuit of a world that just might work, go to TerrenceMcNally.net, TerrenceMcNally.net, or aworldthatjustmightwork.com. They're the same website. If you want to receive my weekly email announcement telling you who's going to be on, what we're going to talk about, and 3 or 4 articles of background, you can sign up at my site or email me at TEMcNally, TEMCNALLY @mac.com. Thanks to you, my listeners. I look forward to being with you again next week.